Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to this debate on exploring alternative financing in developing countries. And congratulations to those of you that survived the intensive debate and discussion that's been going on over the past 2 days, and I hope you're going to get a lot out of this discussion as well. We're here to discuss the topic of exploring alternative financing in developing countries, and we'll be talking about alternative financing in the sense of different to mainstream government financing and different to mainstream and traditional, if you want to call them that, donor financing. Just talking with the panelists, we felt very strongly to emphasize that this is not instead of government financing, this is additional. But how can we find those new sources of financing that actually help to promote predictability, transparency, accountability, and crucially for this meeting, innovation in the education sector? It's a key topic, and here to discuss the topic, we've got a great panel who have had many, many years of experience working on these issues. Dr. Yero Balde is the lead policy advisor to the Vice President for Sector Operations at the Africa Development Bank, one of the major investors in development in the African continent. Prior to that position, he was the chief socioeconomist at the Africa Development Bank, responsible for managing growth and social protection in the bank. And prior to that, Dr. Balde worked in the government in Gambia, so he's seen donor financing on both sides of the table, if you like. Our second panelist is Mr. Iqbal Noor Ali, who is the senior advisor to the Aga Khan Development Network, one of the largest development agencies supporting education, health, environment, and many other development projects across the world. Aga Khan Development Network provided over $600 million in support of such projects in 2010, making it one of the largest sources of alternative financing, if you like, for development. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Rong Wang, who is the founding director of the China Institute for Education Finance Research in Peking University. She has written many books and articles on this topic and is recognized as one of the leading scholars in the field of education finance in China, particularly advised the government on innovative approaches of designing free rural compulsory education policies and several other important education finance policies in China. So, without further ado, let me throw the question open to the panelists and perhaps, Yero, start with you and ask you to give us some examples of your experience of working and helping to deliver alternative sources of financing for education and what's worked and what hasn't worked. Yero.
Thank you very much, Desmond, and of course, let me take this opportunity to thank WISE and the Qatar Foundation for giving us the opportunity to participate in this important summit. Before also going to the topic, I also want to briefly put the discussions into context by giving you a quick overview of what the African Development Bank is for the benefit of those who don't know. We are, a multilateral development bank. I'm responsible for financing development operations in Africa. We have the entire African countries as members, that's 54 African countries, and 25 non-regional members. And we do financing in the form of concessionary loans, non-concessionary, but as well as grants as well. Coming back to the issue of financing of education, I will talk in using three perspectives. One is on the issue of first coming to the issue of domestic resource mobilization, because we strongly believe that the most predictable and sustainable source of financing for education is through domestic resources. Therefore, as a bank, we put a lot of emphasis in terms of what do we do in terms of strengthening those processes, the systems out there that will make sure that there is an efficient utilization of domestic resources for development, including education. This brings us to the issue of what do we do in terms of ensuring that there is an accountable use, there is a transparent use of resources. And as a bank, we've been doing that for many years. We finance basic education, up to about 2008 to the tune of about 1.2 billion. And from 2008 to the present times, we've changed our emphasis from basic education to higher education, science and technology. But in all these things, what we try to do is to make sure that we putting resources where it matters, and to help on achieve that, increasingly through, by way of trying to support domestic resource mobilization, we have increasingly used what we call budget support operations. The idea here is to make sure that in the course of financing education or any other, development operation, be it health, infrastructure, etc., we make sure that there is a good public financial management system, and that ensures the effective and efficient utilization of the resources we have. And within the bank, we've done that by making sure that we strengthen the revenue streams of government to make sure there are additional resources. This could be in the form of tax reforms that will allow additional financing coming. This could also be in the form of having to make sure that there is expenditure control. Making sure that there is a transparent utilization of the resources. This we have done. We've done that in the form of policy reforms because these are policy-based operations. And we've seen significant progress along those lines.
How have you used the alternative forces, though, to really leverage that investment?
Yeah, what we do in terms of alternative financing is in the form of domestic resource mobilization. As you know, I'm just talking about making sure that we have an efficient utilization of existing resources before touching on the alternative financing. Because first and foremost, we have to make sure that the resources we have are put into effective use. I'm just trying to push that point first. And that is through making sure that we have accountable and transparent processes in place and making sure that there are effective policy reforms as far as public financial management is concerned. Because even if we get additional resources, if we don't have the right systems in place, these resources will not give us the desired outcomes. So one way of doing that is what I was emphasizing, the use of budget support operations. Then the other stream perspective is in terms of what do we do as a bank to be a catalyst for additional resources. And this is where our other role comes in terms of, with our AAA rating, we are able to use that to leverage additional financing for development operations, including education. For example, we are able to support and make sure that there is an open space for broad-based participation in development work, which includes education. We are able to open up space for the private sector, space for the foundations, as well as space for individuals in the form of the diaspora. In the case of, in terms of opening up space for broader participation, we have introduced several schemes, such as for private sector development. There is a lot of effort being done in terms of private equity funds. We've successfully done that in infrastructure. We've done some in health, and we're thinking of doing more in education. But as you know, our programs are country-driven, but we have the instrument in terms of private equity funds to support operations that will enhance and support private sector participation. In addition to that, I want to talk briefly about the diaspora also, yes, because we feel that they have an active role and stake to play in terms of education financing or broader financing in the context of our developing countries. So in that context, well, again, as a bank, we've carried out several studies in terms of seeing how do we enhance the role of the diaspora as far as financing of development intervention is concerned, including education. And for that, we have assisting some of the countries in also coming up with homegrown strategies so that they can also use that to sort of leverage additional financing coming from the diaspora. A typical example would be use of diaspora bonds to help support it. The other aspect also is the use of...
stop you there. I'm sure you're getting a lot of ideas. There'll be a lot of questions from the floor, and we'll come back to you, definitely. But thanks for that. It's given us a good overview. But let me now turn to Iqbal. In many ways, as we were talking about before this session, the Aga Khan Foundation and Development Network has been in this business, if you like, for quite a long time, and many consider it to be an alternative source of financing. Say a bit about your experience and how you...
Yes, as you mentioned, we've been in the activity of providing education for well over 100 years. I was telling Desmond on the way here that when I visited Zanzibar a few years ago and walking down Stone Town, I looked up at a building and it said Aga Khan Girls School 1903. And so we've been in that, and we believe in the ladder of education. So our education really begins, as one of my colleagues mentioned the other day, at the prenatal level, really, because through our health system, we provide prenatal care, postnatal care, but our education, formal education, really begins with the early childhood development programs through primary, secondary, and then tertiary through the 2 universities that we have. In terms of us being seen as an alternative approach to financing within the definition you've given, yes, I accept that. Otherwise, I think if you subscribe to the approach that society as a whole has a responsibility for supporting its own growth and improvement, then I don't think we are alternative. I do subscribe to the thought that the primary responsibility for funding education is that of the government, but it is not its exclusive domain. And let me explain why I say that. For those of us who might have looked at this, the role of the non-state player in the provision of education, particularly primary education, is growing. But it is underappreciated, under-recorded, and not sufficiently supported. If you even look at the perceptions about the private sector's role in education, they vary all over the place. Mostly we think about it as elite schools that cater to the rich and the wealthy and not to the poor. Whereas the fact is that non-state players, whether these are citizen-run organizations, NGOs, private for-profit or private non-profit schools, they cover the whole spectrum, including faith-based organizations like churches providing education. But many of the non-state providers of education are actually providing education to children of low-income families. And more we find that poor families are prepared to pay something for their children's education if they see value in it, if they have better access to education. It allows them to hold the teacher and the school more accountable because they are participating in it. And it also helps improve the provision of services from the government when the community itself is involved. So the role of the community ought not to be discounted in the process of the alternative sources of financing. Between 10 to 40%, depending on the region and the country, of children of school-going age actually go to non-state providers of education. And as I said, it's not sufficiently recorded and not sufficiently documented. A couple or 3 examples from the things that we've experimented with other than direct provision of services. We have a program called the Madrasa Resource Center in East Africa where the communities approached us to bring in secular education into Quranic schools. These are community-based programs that the community runs itself. They decide what kind of theology will be taught and so on. But they were anxious for their children to be competitive when they compete for going to primary schools. And in an effort to make them self-financing, we created the notion of mini endowments, where the community itself would create a small endowment, which would be matched by us and by a grant that each center received when the kids graduated from the Madrasa Resource Center. They decided how that money is to be invested, how much of those proceeds or returns on that investment would go towards paying the teacher's salary, because that was the biggest expense. And over time, they have succeeded, by and large, in making that work. It's gone through its share of ups and downs because they invested in certain kinds of funds. Now they've moved towards investing in real estate where they get rent, so there is some security of income. But it's a small enough example. The other point I want to make about alternate financing that comes from the discussion we had this morning that Sheikh Moza sponsored about thinking about innovative partnerships and approaches to financing, and she encouraged us not to think just in sector-specific ways. One of the examples I can give you from our own network is we have the Aga Khan University, which along with its medical school and nursing school and so on, also has diagnostic clinics. The diagnostic clinics create a surplus that funds the cost of the university or helps fill in the operating cost of the university. So there are several examples like that, but the one point that I do want to leave here and for us to think about that we don't often think about, because thinking intersectorally, what about the role of family income in all of this? As I mentioned a minute ago, we find that poor families are also prepared to pay for their children's education if they find value in it. We know from our studies and so on that when family income increases, and especially when women's income increases, more of it goes into the family's health and education than otherwise. That is the domestic resource that I think Yero also alluded to.
Very interesting.
Right?
A very interesting alternative source. Thanks, Iqbal. Again, I'm sure we'll come back further questions on your examples. But let me turn now to Dr. Wang. And I mean, you've had direct experience working at scale with the government of China and helping make better use of government resources, I think, essentially, haven't you? But perhaps tell us a bit about that work.
Okay, thank you. It's Wang. Thank you, Desmond. And first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. And actually, I want to make 3 points. And first point, I want to make a follow-up upon your definition as to what alternative mean. And second, perhaps I should elaborate more on the list of alternatives China has tried, and some of which have been stopped actually. And the third point I want to make is I would caution about the consequences of emphasizing too much upon alternatives to the mainstream government sources. We do have some lessons in China. First of all, about what are the alternatives, because I can't expect some in the audience will definitely ask us about accountability, or the participation of NGO and so on. I kind of feel it's necessary to define what are the alternatives. Alternatives at 3 levels. One is alternatives to from whom to get the money for the education sector. So the question about whom. And second is about mechanism. With what kind of mechanisms to channel the money from financier to the recipient educational institutions. And also, sometimes we actually think the financial management reforms are actually very, very important in terms of enhancing accountability and so on. So there are 3 levels of alternatives, or 3 levels of reforms. So we need to clarify about that first. And I think for reforms or innovations at different levels, they have different political and technical prerequisites. I feel like when we talk about to identify alternatives to who should, give the money to the education sector, you have to check the whole tax system, the whole fiscal system. It's not, in China's experience, it can never be an isolated education reform. It can never be an isolated education financing reform. It's not that a kind of a easy thing. And so that's the first point I want to make.
So let me just be clear. So for you, alternative is about making better use of taxes and the tax system and reforming that. Is that right?
Well, actually, it's not only about that. It's not only about that, because in China, we kind of have experienced some reform in the education financing regime, which I would divide it into 2 stages. And the first stage between 1980s until 2005, that's my own point of view. And it could be characterized as decentralization and diversification. And diversification means that in addition to the mainstream government appropriations from general tax revenues, and the schools and institutions are encouraged to raise money from other sources, and also the government has made a lot of policies. And I can give you a list of such alternatives right now. For instance, a kind of revenue is called, I would call quasi-tax, collected specifically for the education sector, including urban education surcharge in our Chinese terminology, rural education surcharge, local education level. For instance, the urban education surcharge is levied towards enterprises at 2 to 3% of the total of value-added tax and business tax and consumption tax. And rural education surcharge, which was later stopped, was charged towards rural households at 1 to 2% of the rural per capita household income. And in addition, that's a kind of revenues. And in addition to that, we also have social donations. And indeed, actually, in China, we do have tax relief policies towards those that donate to educational institutions. And very recently, actually, the government made some, not recently, okay, I'll go back to the first stage. Okay, but the most important, as I said, yesterday with some of my partners. Like, I kind of feel we can characterize our Chinese strategy as use tomorrow's money, use others' money. Actually, our schools borrow very heavily from commercial banks for outlay expenditures. And, so that's all kinds of a strategy. But all the alternatives, except tuition and fees, proved not to be so, didn't, raise that much money, didn't meet our expectation. And actually, the most important source of revenue, in addition to government appropriations, is tuition and fees, collect directly from students. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, before I throw it open to the floor, what I'm hearing all three of you say is that government financing has to be the main source of financing, particularly for primary and basic education. But I suppose